Hello, comrades. This time I thought I would talk a little bit about classes and what different classes there are. I'll give a little bit of an analysis of different classes. I think the Revolutionary Students' Union, which is it's a organization that works in Utah, I think. They have a video on YouTube where they analyze the various classes in American society, I think. It's been a little while since I saw that, but just decided to give a little shout out to them. Check that video out if you're interested in that. But I'm gonna talk about classes more generally, just go through what kind of different classes there are. This is important to understanding Marxism and understanding Marxism-leninism, because the capitalist way and the right-winger way and how their ideology understands and talks about classes is pretty different from Marxism. They talk about the working class, the middle class, the upper class. They talk about the political class and all these things, which to me it's kind of nonsense, and it can be confusing. Because in capitalism, the amount of money you have is basically how they determine the class you're in. They say the lower class or the working class, your working class, that means you have very little money. If you're middle class, you have a little bit more money, and if you're the upper class, you have a lot of money, basically. Or they say that all politicians are part of the political class. Well, how do they define what that is? I don't know. They're just politicians, so they're part of this political class, whatever that means. It sounds kind of like the feudal way of looking at things, like there's the aristocracy, there's the peasants, there's the clergy, like there's the middle class, there's the political class, whatever. So the Marxist understanding of class is that your class is determined by your relation to the means of production. Now that's a pretty complicated way of saying it, but means of production. If you're a Marxist, you should know what means of production are. So means of production are basically workplaces. They're means of producing products. Factories, mines, mills, farmland, and all kinds of stuff like that, and also infrastructure like power plants and means of communication, means of transport, things like that. They're means of production. So basically, if your relation to the means of production is that you own them and you don't work in them directly. Well, actually, let's start with the workers, because we all want to know about the workers. So let's start with the working class, the proletariat. The term proletarian means that you're a wage worker. So you work. Let's say you work in a factory. Let's give the cliche example. Let's say you work in a factory. You work in a factory. You don't own the factory, but you just work there. And when you make stuff, you don't get the stuff, you just get a wage. So you're a wage worker. You're a hired laborer. So the wage worker's relation to the means of production is that he doesn't have them, he doesn't own them, and he gets a wage. The opposite of that would be a capitalist. A classic stereotypical capitalist just owns the factory, and he doesn't work there himself. So his relation to the means of production is that he owns them. A capitalist means that he is an owner of capital. A capitalist. And in case you don't know what exactly is capital, capital is value in motion. It's money that has been invested, basically. If the money sits there and does nothing, it's not capital. It's just money. But if you have invested it in something, then it's capital. Then it's making more money. So capitalism is the system where money makes more money. Ownership of money gives you more money. Or ownership of invested money, I guess. Not just any money. Because everybody has some money, but it's not all capital. You need to have a lot of it, and you need to invest it, and then it's capital. So the owner of capital is a capitalist. Now there's different kinds of workers and there's different kinds of capitalists, and then there's a couple things in between. So a capitalist is typically someone who doesn't work, at least the stereotypical idea of a capitalist, and it would apply pretty perfectly to someone like who just owns stocks, for example. But for example, a CEO works in a company, and they usually get a ridiculously high salary, but it's still a salary. But just because they work and because they receive a salary doesn't mean they're a wage worker. Because first of all, a capitalist is someone who gets all or at least the majority of their income from ownership of capital. So their main source of income is the ownership of capital. So even if they do some kind of work, for example, give speeches, sign papers, or if they work as a CEO, they're still a capitalist if they own capital and they get tons of money from that. Then the other kinds of workers there are, if, for example, someone who I was talking with a certain right-winger on YouTube in a comments exchange, and they were saying if some guy has a if he's like shining people's shoes and he owns his own shoe shining equipment, then is he a capitalist? Is he exploiting himself? Because a capitalist derives their income from exploiting labor, and a wage worker is by definition exploited by a capitalist. So if they own their own means of production and they work, are they a capitalist who exploits themselves? No, they're not. They are what is called as or what is known as a self-employed worker, someone who owns their own means of production. They're self-employed. They might also be called petty bourgeois or small owner or small capitalist, but that's kind of debatable. Marxism usually refers to self-employed people as petty bourgeois in the sense that they're a small owner, but there can also be small capitalists, so it kind of depends. So if you're self-employed or you're like a freelance person, if you have like a company and you're the only one who works there, then you're self-employed and you're petty bourgeois. Then if you have a small company and you work in your own company and maybe you employ one other person, then the main source of income is still your own work, but you get a little bit of extra income from exploiting that other guy, that other worker. Then you're still a petty bourgeois. Or if you're a farmer, or you're a peasant, and you farm your own land, you're a petty bourgeois. But if you farm your own land and you have occasionally have some hired workers working for you, you're still petty bourgeois, and you get your main income from your own work. But if you're like a kulak, I think a kulak is a good example. Someone who is an exploiter peasant, a peasant who owns land, may possibly even works it. Typically a kulak would work their own land, but they have so much land that they can't work it all themselves, or they might just not wanna bother. But even if they work hard, they just have so much land that they can't farm it all themselves, so they hire a lot of other people, and at that stage their main income is not their own work anymore. Their main income is exploiting all those other workers and getting the profit. So a kulak is a rural capitalist. So they're basically a capitalist. They're a working capitalist. Also, if they speculate on the market, or if they rent land to other people and exploit them by being a landowner, or if they rent other people's land and cultivate it themselves and get profits from that, that's all capitalist activity. And if their main income comes from those, then they're a capitalist. They're not a working peasant anymore. So Marxists often say working classes. So when they're talking about the working class, they mean the proletariat. But when they're talking about the working classes, then they mean all the people who derive the majority of their income from work. So that's wage workers, that's self-employed, that's small owners, but that doesn't mean capitalists. Then there's all kinds of different classes in that same category. For example, peasants who farm land but they don't own the land, or they use tools but they don't own the tools, but they rent them. So peasants who rent the land and peasants who rent the tools. For example, in China before the revolution, those people were pretty much the basis of the revolution, and they were like the poorest section of the population, and they were also the massive majority. People who farmed land that they did not own. They rented the land, and the landowner, the landlord, was the main capitalist. It was the main exploiter. So the landlord would exploit the peasant by demanding large amounts of payment for the use of the land. Then there's of course two kinds of workers. There's physical labor, and then there's mental labor. And obviously all kinds of work usually takes both, but everybody should understand what physical labor means, what manual labor means, and what mental labor means. So obviously a manual laborer still needs brains, and mental laborer still needs to use their physical bodies, but there's still predominantly manual labor and predominantly mental labor, which are distinct from each other. Then there's the so-called labor aristocracy. Labor aristocracy means the section of the working class which has been bribed by capitalism, bribed by the capitalists. They're given privileges. They're given privilege so that they side with the capitalists. Historically, this has been skilled. I said that there's mental and manual labor, but there's also, of course, skilled and unskilled labor, which are distinct from each other. So if you're like digging ditches, or if you're doing something really simple, then you're unskilled. That's like, it's unskilled labor. But if you are doing something that requires a lot of expertise and a lot of education, a lot of training, then you're a skilled laborer. That's what it means. Typically, labor aristocracy has been skilled experts, skilled laborers who get more money in terms of get higher wage anyway, and they usually work in some key section of the industry. For example, they could be in transportation, or they could be some kind of factory organizers, or some kind of factory really skilled, some kind of specific job that requires a lot of skill, that plays a crucial role. The capitalists decide to pay them a lot so that they don't strike, so that they don't become radicalized, and so that the capitalist will try to link the labor aristocracy's interests with their own interests. So, for example, they could even give the labor aristocracy a small share of. They could even give them some stocks or something, small share of the ownership of the company, to try to make sure that the labor aristocracy sides with the capitalists, because the labor aristocracy has a material interest in siding with the capitalists, because they benefit from the situation. The labor aristocracy actually benefits from the exploitative capitalist situation that happens. Now, if we take that to the modern era, and I'm sure third worldism is the big new thing that everybody's talking about. So if we look at the world today, the Western world is incredibly rich compared to the majority of the world. The Western world is incredibly privileged. All the money from all over the world flows to the West, to the Western world, Western imperialist countries. So I think it would be pretty valid to argue that a good chunk of the Western population, Western working class population, is labor aristocracy. If not all of them, probably not all of them, but if not the majority, at least a good chunk, possibly even the majority of the Western workers is labor aristocracy. Now, my issue with third worldism on this subject is that they decide to call it something new when it's just, their labor aristocracy. Labor aristocracy is something that Leninism has talked about for 100 years. I don't see how third worldism has invented something new and profound by saying that, look at those labor aristocrats. Because third worldism didn't invent labor aristocracy. But maybe it's valid to say that it's a new stage of development of imperialism or something. This is going slightly off topic, but I think that in general, like for a long time, Marxism has had a pretty strange idea of what working class means. Because for a really long time, Marxism has tried to be reformist. In Western countries, they've supported parliamentarism and trade union struggle predominantly, even though those people already have way more money than most people in the world. Even though they're labor aristocrats, Marxism has still for some reason supported their trade union struggles and their parliamentary struggles, and it hasn't succeeded, of course, but in bringing socialism. But I just find that interesting because if you read Lenin and Mao and Stalin, they're always talking about how the Western workers are, privileged and not really that reliable. Like, for example, they're talking about the British Labour Party and how it's such a reactionary party. So I just find it interesting how Marxism still focused so much on the Western workers, at least during the Khrushchevite revisionist period. Because if you look at the Western workers, sure, they're not terrible people. I mean, I'm a Western worker myself, but they're not really that radical. I mean, and I'm not trying to say that, every third world worker is somehow like a super communist, because they're not, Generally speaking, like, most people are not communists. That's just the way it is. Most people are not gonna be communists. Like, most people are not even interested in politics. And that is, just the way things are. And you shouldn't expect most people to be interested in politics. In the third world, life is usually so rough and the conditions are so bad that most people, politics doesn't interest them, but politics is being forced upon them because they realize that they have to do something. Even in countries like Ukraine, and even in all the countries where with the Arab Spring and everything, all those people in those countries, politics was forced upon them. They suddenly just decided, okay, there's this situation, we gotta do something, we gotta go to the streets and we gotta be active, and then they were, and that's how it happens. They weren't all somehow deeply devoted to some political idea. They weren't all members of some political party. But in the first world, in the Western world, there just isn't really anything that would trigger that, in my opinion. At least not right now. I mean, in the future there will be something. We don't really know what, but eventually there's going to be something. But you can see that Western people are not really. They don't really have much solidarity with the exploited majority of the world. But you can see that really solidarity is created in struggle. For example, in the United States during the Black Lives Matter thing and the whole thing about the racist police and the racist nature of the United States in general, has all of a sudden there's this struggle in the US, and of course the black struggle has been going on for a long time, but all of a sudden it's getting this media attention, and there's these people who want rights for black people and who want justice, but all of a sudden they also start to talk about Palestine, and they also start to talk about Afghanistan and all that. And it just shows that there's solidarity between people who have a common struggle. The white people, they don't give a fuck. The Western workers, they don't care. But the Native Americans and black people and all kinds of oppressed groups, they have much more solidarity for other oppressed people. And if you look at Northern Ireland, for example, they've always been actively supporting Palestine. So to me, it's important to realize that sometimes it's kind of pointless to try to make people feel sympathetic and have solidarity for oppressed groups, because really most people don't care. Most people are not into politics. Most people don't care. It just something that solidarity just emerges in the struggle. And also, if you think about the level of anti-communist hysteria in the West, People are trying to combat these lies about communism, which is good. We should do that. But most people are still gonna believe the lies about communism. I mean, we should try to debunk those lies as best we can, but most people are still probably gonna believe them. But if you look at a country like India or the Philippines, those people, they are not too worried about Stalinism. They don't care. They don't, like, the government tells them, you know, Stalinism is horrible. Well, they're like, the government is horrible. They don't believe a word of what the government is telling them. So the government can tell them all these anti-communist lies, but they don't believe them. They don't believe the government's lies anymore, because they see capitalism for what it really is. But in the West, you know, capitalism is not too terrible for most people in the West. So there is, after all, there is still quite a lot of trust for the government. People still generally trust the government. It's not like in India. In any case, that's just sort of off-topic point I wanted to make. At least that's something I've been thinking about. But anyway, that's my rambling take on classes and such. So feel free to voice your opinions. If you have any thoughts on what I said, feel free to share them. And I will see you guys next time with another video. So, red salute.